Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming. Welcome to the University of Edinburgh and to the McEwen Hall. This is one of our fine buildings. It's where we have many of the graduation ceremonies, we have exams, we have open days, and we have lectures like this. Unfortunately, although it's a very beautiful building, it's one of the buildings that's actually very hard to keep, but it is built completely with beer money from the McEwens many years ago. So this is the first in this year's series of Enlightenment lectures, and we've had quite a lot of very good lectures. Irene Calm, Tom Devine, Jose Barraza, Ian Wilmot. So there's been a whole series of absolutely excellent Enlightenment lectures. And today is the first day of a new term and a new academic year. So it's really nice to also have the first of this series of Enlightenment lectures. And I'm especially pleased because we've now got a number of postdoc societies around the university, and the postdoc society have been the ones who've organised this lecture and chosen the speakers. So I'm very pleased that I'm going to be introducing Professor Steve Jones. He's Professor of Genetics and he's Head of Genetics at UCL in London. Steve was born in Wales, but he saw sense and came to Edinburgh to do his degree and his PhD, so he's an Edinburgh graduate. And so we're particularly pleased. We lay claim to our ex-graduates when they do really good things. So we're very pleased to have Steve back again to give this talk. He's a prize-winning author with many books on evolution. But what I want to say is really that Steve has worked an awful lot on evolution. He's written over 100 scientific papers, serious scientific papers on things like snails and fruit flies. So he's one of those rare people that bridges that gap between doing hard science and then engaging with the public about what he does. And he's written huge numbers of books. He won the Michael Faraday Prize from the Royal Society for his activities in public engagement. And he's been a TV presenter, he's been a radio broadcaster, he's been involved in various TV series, and he also has a column in the Daily Telegraph. So, welcome to the first University of Edinburgh Enlightenment lecture of the series for this year, and Steve is going to talk to us about is human evolution over? So, welcome, Steve.
For those of you who've got a train to catch, the answer is yes. So you can leave now if you want to. I think the idea of evolution goes back, I think we all know, that the idea of evolution goes back long before Charles Darwin. People may not have had a mechanism for evolution, but the notion of change is a very, very ancient one. You can see it among the ancient Greeks, among the Egyptians and the like, the feeling that things are going to alter in the future. And nearly always that change has a direction to it, often an optimistic one. Here we have perhaps the very first model of the human future, which is written by Thomas More, who was an English cleric, of course, of the 16th century, executed for not going along with the religious orthodoxy of the day. And he wrote a book and invented the word called utopia. And he drew a map of utopia, which looks rather like the Isle of Wight, which is not where I'd expect to find utopia, but be that as it may. And in Thomas More's mythical utopia, many things have changed. It's an interesting book. It's rather hard to read because it's in antique language, but it's an interesting book. And what happens is that society undergoes a great revolution. In that book and in several others which descend from it, which are very similar, things happen like chamber pots are now made of gold, because gold is useful as an easily malleable metal. People who become ill are sent to prison because they haven't looked after themselves. People who people who commit crimes are put into hospital because there must be something wrong with them. And it's an interesting model of the future, the utopia, which will emerge as the years go by. And there are many books like that. And the interesting aspect of that utopia is, although society may change, the people stay the same. The utopians who lived in this carefully mapped place here would looked just exactly like you and I, although perhaps they behaved in a very, very different way. But about 100 years ago, there was a complete switch in people's models of the future of human evolution, as we might call it, because there are plenty of utopian models and novels and films and so on around today. The whole of science fiction is utopian, talking about what's going to happen in the future, and generally they all have one simple plot, one simple kind of utopian who looks like this. This, I'm told, comes from Star Trek, although I've never actually seen Star Trek, I'm ashamed to say, being an ignorant person. And what happens in Star Trek, and its many, many similar books and series, is that actually society is much the same. There are warring tribes, there are hierarchies of command, there's a bit of love interest here and there, lots of violence. So we'd recognize the society, but the people change. The people generate unlikely eyebrows like this, or non-functional ears, or pointed teeth and peculiar noses. So actually what we now have, in most people's view of the future, is not a social change, but a biological change. And I think you can actually relate that event to a particular book, which has a rather interesting history. And his book is H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, written in the late 19th century. And I'm sure not nearly all of you will have read the book, but it's the first modern utopian novel, really. And the plot is, at first sight, straightforward. What happens is somebody called the time traveler, who's never actually named, this time traveler develops a machine, a bit like a bicycle, which you can leap on and zoom off into the future. So he gets off on his bicycle, zooms off into the future, some unspecified time in the years to come, and slows down and stops, and wakes up in somewhere which actually is a bit like Morningside. It's full of charming people who've had their tea, I have to say. They've had that by the time he arrives. It's full of charming, intelligent people who live in nice buildings and read The Guardian and chit-chat over the hedge. Perhaps a slightly insipid place to live, but certainly perfectly tolerable. And he settles in this place. A little bit of decorous love interest takes place between himself and one of the locals. And these people of the future in this utopia, this charming, wonderful suburb, are called the Eli. And he stays among the Eli for some weeks and months. And slowly it transpires that the Eli have a terrible secret. Because there's another group of people, too, who don't live in some metaphorical Morningside. Rather, they emerge from some theoretical Leith Walk, the lower end thereof. And they're terrible, terrible thugs, okay? Actually, they come out at night, quite an accurate statement when it comes to Leith Walk in my memory of Edinburgh. They come out at night and they get drunk and they throw up. And they beat up these unfortunate Eli and they burgle their houses. So not much has changed, really, in the last 20 or 30 years. And in fact, they even kill and eat them. And even in Leith, that doesn't happen very often. Okay. And what's actually happened is that the human race has split into two different species. The Eli, who are charming but ineffective, and these brutal thugs who actually live underground and come out and brutalize them for much of the time. So that's an evolutionary model of the future. It's a dystopian model of the future. And of course, Wells being a good novelist, there is a twist in the tale. And the twist in the tale is that actually the Eli are just the domestic animals of the Morlocks. They're just the equivalent of sheep and cattle, and the Morlocks feed them and let them have a nice time and drink tea in this metaphorical Morningside, and then they kill them and they eat them. So what's actually happened is that the human race has evolved into a brutal race of thugs. Now, you can actually trace that fear of the future, of the biological future, to one particular individual, Francis Galton. Francis Galton was the founder of my laboratory at UCL, the Galton Laboratory. He was, of course, as everybody knows, Charles Darwin's cousin. He was very interested. He was a remarkable man. He was the classic example of a flawed scientist. He was somebody who, had he started a PhD, would never have finished it. Because once he'd done one thing, he leapt off and did something else partially. He never really thought things through. He did a number of remarkable things. He was the first person to use fingerprints in detective work, for example. He wrote a paper which baffles me, called Arithmetic by Smell. He was the only person to make a beauty map of the British Isles based on going around British cities and scoring the local females on a 5-point scale from attractive to repulsive. The high point was in South Kensington, where perhaps it still is, outside Harrods, and the low point, you'd be glad to hear, was in Aberdeen. I once said this in Aberdeen, and I had to run. I managed to bite my tongue without saying where it still is, so I got away with that. And Galton was very much concerned about human quality. And that beauty map was only part of his exploration of human qualities. He looked at height and weight and strength and intelligence and that kind of stuff. And he was convinced that human quality was inherited. He wrote a book called Hereditary Genius, which is sometimes called the first human genetics textbook. It really isn't. It's a political book rather than a scientific book. But he was the founder of the science, or the quasi-science, of eugenics, who felt that the human race would decline, unless something was done about it. His views were really quite stark. Here's a summary of this is an interesting diagram. This is Galton's diagram of racial ability. It's an interesting diagram because it's the first ever statistical distribution, first ever published statistical distribution. It's rather a crude one, but that's what it is. If you look down, the ancient Greeks are pretty smart, but they're extinct, so that doesn't matter. That's the English, not the British. The English were almost as smarter than the Asians being smarter than the Africans, and you'll see a considerable overlap between Australians and dogs, all right? And again, I once showed this at Sydney, and that didn't go down too well either. Well, you can disapprove of that, as of course I do. But it is a statement of the way that people thought, that there were huge differences in ability among individuals and among races, and the second-rate genes were taking over. That notion, needless to say, is an evolutionary one. It's a Darwinian one that comes from Charles Darwin himself. And I want to argue that actually things are now in such a state in biology, and a good state, not a bad state, that we know so much about the process of evolution and the past of human evolution that, unlike Galton, unlike H.G. Wells, unlike Thomas More, who simply guessed about the future, we are now in a position to make some at least educated guesses about what may to come in the next few hundred, the next few thousand years. So let me talk briefly first about Charles Darwin, about what his theory actually is, and I'm sure you all know, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves. Darwin defined the theory of evolution in 3 simple and pregnant words: descent with modification. Descent, the passage of information from one generation to the next. Modification, the fact that that passage was imperfect, that there were mistakes, and therefore there was bound to be change. It was very, very simple. Evolution is so simple it could almost be physics, in fact. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. We can rephrase Darwin's notion in modern terms as evolution is genetics plus time. You've got genetics, you've got DNA, you've got mutation, errors in transmission, you've got time, 3,500 million years since the origin of life, and it is absolutely inevitable and unavoidable that things will change. So that's what the core of Darwin's theory was. And it was an old idea. It had been used many years previously by linguists and by other people. Darwin had a second part, and a much cleverer part, which is entirely his own, of the evolutionary mechanism, which was natural selection. And I'll return to natural selection a little bit later in the lecture, simply because it is so important. So evolution is fundamentally about differences. It's about differences among individuals. It's about differences in individuals' response to the environment they face. And it's about random differences that take place through the accidents of sampling from generation to generation. Mutation, selection, and genetic drift, to use the somewhat slightly technical language that we would use to describe those three components. And my case is, and I think there's some merit in it, that actually all those three processes, mutation, selection, and drift, have greatly modified and reduced their activity in modern human populations, at least in the developed world, and at least for the time being, which means that evolution is in effect over. I'll put a health warning on that statement. I mean evolution in the sense, as it's usually described by the general public, some change in structure or in form, some development in something different. Certainly evolution is not over in the biologist's sense, because to a biologist, evolution is simply a change in gene frequencies from generation to generation. And that's still going on. But I'll talk about it in the general sense, as seen by most of the public. So what we need to do is to look at these three processes: mutation, selection, and genetic drift. Now, mutation, errors in copying DNA, is universal. Everybody will be a different person at the end of this lecture from what they were at the beginning, because everybody will have made several hundred miles of DNA in their bodies, and there will be many, many mistakes made, some of which I have to tell you may kill you because they cause cancer during that process. So mutation goes on all the time. It's not a rare process, it's a common process, and we know a great deal about it. Mutation builds up diversity, and we have a huge amount of genetic diversity in the human race. I used to proudly boast that to my undergraduates that every person alive was different, apart from identical twins, every person alive was different from every other person, not only alive, but everybody who ever had lived or ever would live in the future, because of the accumulation of difference and mutation. The latest estimates are much more startling. They are, because we've begun to look at variation at the DNA level, every sperm and every egg ever made in the history of humankind is different from every other sperm and every other egg. And given that every time a man has sex, he makes enough sperm to fertilize every woman in Europe, that's a lot of difference, okay? So there's a huge amount of difference out there which traces itself ultimately to mutation. And one of the common themes in utopian or dystopian novels and science fiction is some terrible mutation event caused by an exploding nuclear power station or by rays from outer space that gives rise to giant rats who run around eating people and the like. And that was a real fear in the days of genetics, even 40 or 50 or maybe 60 years ago. There was a geneticist, a great geneticist who worked a while here in Edinburgh, H.J. Muller, who worked on the effects of X-rays in causing mutation, which they most emphatically do. Another concern was the effect of chemicals in causing mutation. Genetics is such an amazingly young subject, and it's hard to believe that I myself, in my own undistinguished way, was taught my elementary genetics by the woman here in Edinburgh who discovered the effects of chemicals in damaging DNA, Charlotte Auerbach, who was an amazing woman. And it's a bit like a physicist being taught by Newton, you know, somebody who founded an entire branch of the science, teaching the next generation. So there was real concern, particularly about the time of the Second World War, that we were going to damage our DNA with chemicals and radiation and God knows what. Perhaps the most cynical scientific experiment ever carried out is summarized by this slide here, which is a picture of the atom bomb dropping on Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945. And of course, another one was dropped a few days later on Nagasaki, and the Japanese emperor, in a classic piece of party political broadcast speak, spoke to his nation for the first time ever they'd ever heard from him. Fellow Japanese, he said, the war is developing in a direction not necessarily to our country's advantage. In other words, we surrender. And they surrendered, and within a week, a team of scientists had been sent into Hiroshima and into Nagasaki. And they were of two kinds. There were physicists who wanted to know what damage the bomb had done, and they were horrified by what it had done. And there were biologists who were going to look not just at the effects of the radiation, which was massive, on those who'd experienced it, and it killed lots and lots of people, and lots more people died of radiation sickness, but more interesting, in a rather cynical way, at the effects on their children. because there was a strong expectation that there would be a massive effect on the DNA of the next generation, a huge increase in the mutation rate, which had been brought about by exposure to radiation. Well, this was in 1945, and I have to say, and with the benefit of hindsight, it was an entirely futile exercise because we didn't have any means for looking for human mutations. But the Atomic Bomb Control Commission, as it was called, the ABCC, stayed in Hiroshima until 5 or 6 years ago when it felt its task was complete. And the short answer is, they found no effects of the bomb whatsoever. At the end of their 60 years in Hiroshima, DNA technology was beginning to emerge, and they were able to look at the DNA of parents and offspring. They found altogether 27 different mutations, 27 changes out of many hundreds of thousands or more of genes that they looked at, 27 changes in children compared to their parents. As I said, the bombs had no effect, but there was one very interesting and remarkable observation. 24 of those changes had taken place in the father and not the mother. Now we know that for many mutations, at least, perhaps not all, that's a universal truth, that many more mutations take place in the male line than in the female line. And that has some rather important implications. It's easy to see why it happens like that. Males and females make their sex cells, sperm and eggs, in quite different ways. Females make their eggs, women make their eggs effectively before they're born. They're generated and put into sort of suspended animation and then released at intervals throughout their reproductive lives. And what that means is there's only a limited number of cell divisions, each of which has a chance of error, between the egg that a woman makes and the egg that she passes on to her son or to her child. In fact, it's about 7 or 8 cell divisions, most people say. Not very many. Males are quite different. Men never rest. Men make sperm all the time, even when they're giving lectures in the McEwen Hall. And that means that there's a huge number of cell divisions between the sperm that makes a man and the sperm that he passes on to the next generation. And for the mean age of human reproduction in the West, for men, which is now about 26, there are something like 600 or 700 cell divisions between the sperm that made him and the sperm that he passed on. And every time that sperm is made, it's a division of a division of a division of a division. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. There's a chance of mutation, and that's why there are more mutations among men than among women. But the effect is worse than that, because actually it means that the older the man is, the more mutations he's likely to pass on in the next generation. And the effect is not small. For a 51-year-old father, for example, there are something like 2,000 cell divisions. And for a 75-year-old father, and such people certainly exist, there may be 3,000 or 4,000 cell divisions, each of which has got a chance of error, and each of which can increase the mutation rate. And here's a slide we don't have to look at in detail, which certainly understates the case, actually, of various kinds of mutation which are generated anew. The one we show is the Velázquez painting of the dwarf, achondroplasia, short arms and legs, and you can see a striking increase from 24-year-old fathers to 50-year-old fathers. It goes up by about 5 or 6 times, but if you go to 70-year-old fathers, it goes up by about 10 times. And for these various other things, the same. There's a recent paper which I find hard to accept, but the evidence seems clear, which asks about the effects of paternal age, and maternal age for that matter, on the intelligence of children. And the effect is reasonably striking. Let me get this right. I've only just dug this out, so I'll have to remind myself what it's like. These are various measures of IQ. Measures of IQ and paternal age. Let's just look at the top left one, okay? For the paternal age from around 16 to about 60, IQ score drops on the average for fathers. The downward pointing line is the age of fathers. IQ drops on the average from about 108 points for 18-year-old fathers to about 100 points or a bit less for the children of 60-year-old fathers. Now that might be due to mutation, The thing which is really strange is that the other line, the one that goes up, is the age of mothers. So that actually older mothers tend to have more intelligent children. I don't don't understand. But it's a hint that there may be something interesting going on. So if you want to know about what's going to happen to the future of the human mutation rate, don't start worrying about radiation and chemicals, because their effects are really very small. Ask about the age of fathers. And actually, the figures are really rather surprising. What's actually happened in the developed world is that there are fewer older fathers than there used to be. And that might seem surprising, but what's happened in the developed world for both men and women is that actually we now confine our reproductive lives into a very, very short period. In ancient times, and to a degree still in Africa and such places, what happened was that everybody who reached sexual maturity began reproducing as soon as they were biologically able to, and ceased reproducing as soon as they were biologically unable to. Perhaps because they were dead, or perhaps because they'd reached menopause, but there was a wide spread of maternal and paternal age. That's changed. Here's a diagram that shows the fertility with age of men, age of fathers in effect, in a variety of countries. In Cameroon, which is shown as a red dotted line, in Pakistan, the blue dotted line, and in the most advanced country of all, of course, which is France, which is the black solid line. And if you look at Cameroon, in fact, in Cameroon, more than half, or about half of all children are born to fathers over 45, which is when this effect begins to come in. In Pakistan, which has moved further on in the development stakes, something like probably 10 or 15% of children are born in fathers over 45. In France, about 5%. Okay? And the same is true in Britain. So there are far fewer older fathers than before, so that rather counterintuitively, if anything has happened to the mutation rate, it's gone down. So the notion that our biological future, our evolution, is going to be damned by an increase in the mutation rate is simply wrong. Okay? So let's move now. I don't think mutation is the central mover in this argument, but it's interesting to see that effect. Let's move now to perhaps the more important part of the Darwinian argument, which is natural selection. Now, natural selection is simple, at least in principle. Natural selection consists of inherited differences in the chances of reproducing. Okay? If you bear a gene which makes it more likely that you will survive, find a mate, and reproduce than people who bear a different version of the same gene, your version will become common in subsequent generations, and it will help the evolving line to adapt to new circumstances, and in time, as Darwin suggested, may give rise to new forms of life. Many people find natural selection almost impossible to accept. The entire intelligent design movement, the stupid non-design movement, says the eye is so complicated that natural selection couldn't do it. Well, that's just plain silly. I often think of natural selection as a factory for making almost impossible things. Everybody in this room is an almost impossible thing. Some possibly more impossible than others. How would I know? It's highly unlikely that any one of us is here, but every one of us stands on a mound of billions of corpses of people who did not survive and reproduce. That's why we look the way we do. And natural selection, inherited differences in reproduction, is a kind of series of successful mistakes. There's no planning, there's no foresight, but it worked. Ironically enough, I myself was first exposed to the power of natural selection in a genuine factory. I made the perhaps unwise decision, because every university in Britain turned me down one year, and then only Edinburgh accepted me the next year. Standards were low in those days. I made the perhaps unwise decision, although in retrospect, I think it was a good idea. I left school and I went to work. I started training as an engineer or a fitter in a soap factory on Merseyside. Okay? And I went around the factory learning things. I did a lot of stripping of asbestos off of valves, and I'm still waiting for the possible effects of that. So far, so good. But one of the things I spent a couple of months in what was called the detergent shed. And to make detergent, to make washing powder, the principle is simple. The practice is much more difficult. But what you do is you take a huge vat, not quite as big as this hall, but big, and you fill it with a boiling hot chemical liquid under pressure, and you force that liquid through a nozzle. And as it comes out of the nozzle, it bursts into two phases. It bursts into a vapor, which is taken away by fans and recirculated, and the powder, which is your famous washing powder. And in my day, the nozzles looked like this. They were about that long, made of stainless steel, heavy, rather pretty, beautiful things, expensive to make. And they were useless. They kept getting blocked. They made grains of different sizes. One nozzle would only work with one particular formulation of chemicals. They were really very, very primitive things. So what the factory owners did, and did it across the world, was to hire a series of intelligent designers, really intelligent designers, mathematicians, physicists, giant brains of that kind, to try and improve this. And they had very limited success because the physics of moving from a liquid to a solid plus a powder, a phase transition as it's called, is very hard to understand. Almost without realizing it, I think, at the time, the engineers and the designers then moved on to classic Darwinian natural selection. What they did was to make 10 copies of that nozzle and mutate them, to change them slightly. At random, longer or shorter, a bigger or smaller hole, different angle of attack as the liquid went in, and so on. And they tested them against each other. And maybe one of them was marginally better, 1% better than one had gone before. So they took that one, allowed it to reproduce, made 10 copies of itself, changed it at random, and carried on the process. It inherited differences in the chances of reproduction or natural selection, and very quickly they saw a remarkable change. Here's a rather primitive model of what happened. Over the generations, they began to evolve, and I use that word advisedly. They began to evolve through natural selection, a highly unlikely, almost impossible nozzle, which looked like that, and worked 100 times better than what had gone before. And nobody designed that. There was no foresight. It happened by the simple Darwinian machine. So it works. And it works on inherited differences. Well, it works on humans too. I'll just give you one example of how it works on humans, that it does work on humans as much as on nozzles. One of the odd things about the human race, two odd things about the human race. First of all, we're biologically very similar from place to place. At the DNA level, compared to chimpanzees, for example, we're remarkably homogeneous. But physically, we look pretty different from place to place, and needless to say, most of all, in terms of skin color. And the evolution of white skin is a classic of Darwinian natural selection. Really, it turns on we all know that the people in the tropics have dark skin, people in northern parts tend to have lighter skin. And the question is why? It turns on a chemical called melanin, and everything we know about melanin is good. Having a black skin, having lots of melanin, in almost every way is a big, big plus. It protects against skin cancer, protects against aging of the skin, improves your eyesight, even improves your hearing. All those things are worse in people with white skin. So why this strong effect of whiteness as we moved away from Africa somewhat less than 100,000 years ago? Well, it has to turn, as you probably know, on vitamin balance, on a particular vitamin called vitamin D, which is made in the skin if ultraviolet light from the sun can actually get through it. We know a lot about the genetics of this system now, and it's really a classic of what the power of modern genetics. The gene for much of the melanin variation from place to place was actually found in a fish, a zebrafish, in which is a mutation called the golden zebra, which the melanin is taken away. People did some classic experiments of crossing these fish. They found the gene, sequenced the DNA, looked through the human genome, which you can do in a second with these extraordinary programs which are freely available, these databases, found the gene in humans and discovered there was an almost complete shift between different parts of the world. Let's just you can see that. Let's just look at Africa and Europe. And this is one of the genes that controls skin color. Something like 99% of all sub-Saharan Africans have one amino acid in one part of this molecule, one building block, and something like 99% of native Europeans have got a different amino acid in the same place. It's actually the most strikingly structured gene that we know in the human genome. So it's a big, big effect. Something caused it. That something, as we'll see in a moment, was natural selection. There's a spin on the tail. Look over to Asia and Japan. Now, people in Asia and Japan have rather light-colored skins. They've lost most of their melanin. But they have the African form of this gene. So what's going on? What's actually happened is that natural selection, which doesn't plan ahead, has picked up a different mutation in China and Japan, so that white skin has evolved, or light-colored skin has evolved at least twice, perhaps more times, so the actual tree of it looks like that. So whatever it was that changed us from black to white must have been pretty powerful because it happened twice. It might even happen more, and it happened quickly. It probably happened within 50,000 years or less. It's quite likely, in fact, that the first Britons, the first modern humans to live in Britain, were black, which is a startling thought, which I recommend to the anti-racists among you. Okay? So what was it due to? Well, as I hinted, it's almost certainly due to vitamin D balance. If you have a black skin, you cannot make vitamin D successfully in the sun. If you have black skin, you can't make enough vitamin D. If you have a white skin, you can. And an absence of vitamin D does all kinds of horrible things. It causes rickets, for example, soft, bendy bones, because the bones can't be laid down. The calcium and the phosphate isn't metabolized properly. And were you to look in Glasgow's Necropolis Cemetery, particularly, also in Edinburgh, at children's bones from the 19th century and earlier, you would find a high proportion of them, particularly in Glasgow, would have rickets. That was because it was smoky, there was no sun, there was the window tax, which closed up windows, people never went outside, and they got rickets, and they died in their thousands and their tens of thousands. People think that rickets is an ancient disease that's gone away. It's not. It's still the second commonest non-communicable disease of childhood in the world. All those children who died of rickets were fuel for natural selection, because those with lighter skin could make vitamin D. Those with darker skin died of rickets, and those dark skin genes were replaced by light skin genes really quite quickly. We now know that actually the vitamin D is actually much, much more important than we ever thought. It's actually absolutely central to all kinds of health problems in terms of muscles and bones and blood pressure, control of pathogens. It even, low levels of vitamin D mean that you actually have difficulty in controlling the spread of cancer. Some people even say that the rather poor health of the Scots compared to the English, particularly in the west of Scotland, may be due to a shortage of vitamin D simply because of the absence of sunshine. I think that the liquor that built this hall may have something to do with it. I don't know, but certainly that's an interesting thought. And there's even been claims that the Scottish diet should be supplemented with vitamin D. Which I don't think will go anywhere because vitamin D has dangers if you have too much of it. But it's an interesting thought. And the effect, as I say, is quite big. If you look at plasma vitamin D levels in African Americans, shown solid here, and in European Americans, most African Americans, even today, are short of vitamin D, and most European Americans have got plenty of vitamin D. And there are spins on the story. So that's natural selection through climate in humans. There's a spin on the story I'll mention briefly. There are, of course, some superhumans, particularly common here in Scotland and in Scandinavia, enormously admired by the rest of us. And these are people with this very rare and aberrant mutation. This is Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, in characteristically alert pose. And you can see that Boris is a blonde. Science has at last solved the mystery of the blonde, okay? Where did blondes come from? What is the point of blondes, for God's sake? I've often wondered, not being one myself, all right? Well, it's actually the same story. If you look at the spread of farming across Europe, which began about 10,000 years ago, it didn't actually get to Western Europe. Blondes, of course, are very, very geographically limited. This is a map of blondes before people began to move, perhaps in about 1700. And you can see that in Scandinavia, mainly in Scotland, plenty of blondes and redheads in Ireland, almost none in southern Europe. When farming began to spread with grains in the early days, and that caused great problems with health as it happens, you cannot grow grains, primitive grains, north of a line of somewhere that goes, roughly speaking, through Liverpool. And that's because grains of the primitive kind need a warm spring to germinate. And that means, in most places, that means a warm, sunny spring to germinate. And you can't grow them north of that line, across Liverpool, through somewhere like Hamburg and across. So farmers stopped and didn't go any further than that for a long time. There's one exception to that statement, and that's in northwest Europe, in Scandinavia and in Britain. Because here we can grow grains because we have a warm spring because of the Gulf Stream. So we have warmth brought in, even though we have no sun in the springtime. So that when farming arrived, people could move to this very unhealthy diet, almost absent in vitamin D, even though they never saw the sun. So any mutation which further lightened the skin, the famous blonde, was favored, and that's why we have blondes and redheads in northwest Scotland, in Ireland, and in Scandinavia. And it happened quite recently. This is a very crappy slide, I'm afraid, but it shows that farming got to Scotland probably about 6,000 years ago. It got to Scandinavia, parts of Scandinavia, less than 1,000 years ago. So all this happened very, very quickly. So natural selection can work on humans, and if I wanted to, and I don't, and I'm sure you don't want either, I could give you many, many more examples of that happening. So you could speculate about what's going to happen to natural selection by asking about, are we going to control malaria? Are we going to put vitamin D in the food? But we don't need to do any of that because we can make some very precise statements about what's going to happen to natural selection, not with biological information, but with demographic information, information about numbers. And it's interesting indeed that Darwin himself was drawn to the idea of natural selection by Thomas Malthus's book on population. Population's growing. And it was those numbers that made Darwin think about natural selection. That population went up, he thought, geometrically, and resources only arithmetically. Well, we have figures on human survival, too. I start my first-year lectures in UCL, which I won't do until next week, by asking, well, actually, I always start them in the same pathetic joke. I say, I'm a geneticist, and my job is to make sex boring. And the students look blankly at me, but 25 lectures later, by God, they agree. But then I say, okay, look to the person to your left and the person to your right. And this is only, for those geneticists in the audience, this is only a partly accurate statement. I say 2 out of every 3 of you will die for reasons connected to the genes you carry. Of cancer, of heart disease, of diabetes, all of which have got a strong genetic component. So they look a bit blank at that. But I say, don't worry, if I'd been giving this lecture in Shakespeare's time, 2 out of every 3 of you would be dead already. And that's actually true. And here are the figures for life and death of children in England and Scotland. The figures are probably more or less identical. You can see, in roughly speaking, Shakespeare's time, 1/3 of all British children died before they were 21. In Darwin's time, 1809 is his birthplace, but something rather less than half died before they're 21. In 2001, 99% of all babies who last for the first month will last until they're 21. Now, because natural selection turns on differences, particularly differences among young people, if there are no differences, there's no natural selection. Okay? So you don't have to go through lots of examples and hand-waving. You just look at these figures. There are no differences. There's no natural selection. It's as simple as that. So that part of natural selection has stopped, and I'm pretty confident of that statement. Maybe just for the time being, and certainly only in the developed world. It isn't true in Africa, but it stopped. Okay? However, there's a spin on the story, as Darwin himself, the great god Darwin, realized, that natural selection is like the driving test. It's a 2-part exam. You've got to pass both papers. The first one's easy. By definition, we've all passed it because we're all still alive. At least I hope we're all still alive. And it's, you stay alive. And basically, we stay alive. Second part is the practical exam. And that's much more difficult. You've got to find a mate, have sex, and have children. Okay? And from evolution's point of view, I'm sad to report, I might just as well be dead because I have no children. So you need to understand the power of natural selection, the action of natural selection. You need also to ask how much variation, how much difference is there in the number of children that people have. And as Darwin realized, and it's obvious indeed, there is much, much more chance of variation in sexual success among males than among females. Because males are limited only by the number of females they can persuade or force to mate with them. Females are limited by the simple facts of biology, of the number of children they can have and childcare and that kind of stuff. And there's plenty of evidence of people in the old days who had many, many children. But and that even happens quite recently. Here's a picture of a family on holiday in Sweden. You probably recognize the chap. This is in the 60s. You probably recognize the chap with a red circle around his head. That's Osama bin Laden, okay? Everybody in that photograph is either his brother, his sister, his half-brother, or his half-sister. And Osama bin Laden's father, Mohammed bin Laden, had 22 wives and 53 children. The last time that Osama was allowed people to count his family, he had 5 wives and 22 children. Well, if somebody has 22 wives, there's 21 other blokes out there who are smiting their brows or doing something because they're not getting mates, okay? So there's a massive variation in male mating success. Some people are having huge numbers of children, men more than women, more variation in men than in women. Others are not, and if there's any genetic basis to that, then that's an agent of natural selection. That was Darwin's argument for the peacock's tail of sexual selection. And that leaves its mark in many ways. For example, we can work out how many males have mated in the past by looking at the patterns of Y chromosome variation, the male chromosome in different populations. All of us, or men, and half the people or so in this room have got a Y chromosome. The other half, females, don't. And the Y chromosome has quite a lot of variation on it. And there's a whole industry now, of which I've played a small part, of going out and looking at patterns, the geography of Y chromosomes across the world. And what you find, generally speaking, that if we were to take a bunch of Scots or Brits, as I insist on saying, you would find that most of us in this room, most of the men in this room, had really pretty different Y chromosomes from everybody else. It's quite a variable chromosome, and there's lots and lots of different kinds, none of which gets particularly common in most populations. However, there are exceptions to that. Here's a map of Y chromosome variation in Ireland. And there is a focus of one particular Y chromosome in Donegal and thereabouts, where up to 20% of men have an Y chromosome identical to other men, or almost so, to other men in the same population. They all belong to a group of families with surnames, and I'll come back to the surnames in a moment, with surnames that they believe to descend from the High Kings of Ireland. The people who ruled the warlords, the Osama bin Ladens of ancient Irish history, which they certainly were, who ruled for hundreds of years. There's one called Niall of the Nine Hostages, who lived in the 6th century, who's recorded as having had 20 wives and many children, and his sons did just the same thing. As a result, many other men had no children at all, and that Y chromosome still persists 1,000 years and more later. So the effect is very real. So to answer our question about the future of natural selection, we need to know about the patterns of reproduction too. And it's very clear that they have changed in many ways. There is no longer, almost anywhere in the world, is there anywhere where men have 53 wives and 122 children. Some men might have 8 or 10 children, possibly even 20. But most men have 0, 1, 2, or 3 children, women ditto. So that's collapsed too, and you can see that in many ways. Here's fertility in Europe from 1882 to 2000, in West Europe, Eastern Europe, and in Russia. We don't need to look at the details. Fertility levels have gone down, largely because many more children survive. But the interesting thing is that the variation in fertility from place to place and from family to family has also collapsed. And you can put those two figures on variation in fertility and variation in mortality together to get a statistic called the opportunity for natural selection. And in the last 200 years in Europe, the opportunity for natural selection, the differences have lost their power by 9/10. So natural selection is finished. Forget it. It's over, at least for now. So let me turn finally to the last part of the Darwinian argument, the argument about random change, particularly in small populations. And Darwin, the great god Darwin, who left the University of Edinburgh, of course, after a year, a great mistake, I always thought. He was a bloody smart cookie. He immediately realized that there was something special about populations on islands. He noticed, of course, as we all know, that on the Galapagos, the birds, the plants, and so on, and the tortoises were different from those on the mainland. On the Cape Verde Islands, which are the first islands he went to, it was just the same. They were African birds and the like, but they were different from those on the mainland. Why was that? Well, if you read The Origin, or even better, you read my rewrite of The Origin, it's called Almost Like a Whale, still available in all good bookshops. Darwin admits that a lot of that happened at accident. Just by accident, a few individuals were blown across the sea. They carried, as we would say in modern parlance, a small sample of genes, and so things changed at random in small populations. And that effect is big. And the effect in humans was, in fact, first discovered, rather surprisingly maybe, by Francis Galton. And Galton, as I say, was a clever guy. He was also a rich guy, as was Darwin. And Galton had the habit of going on walking holidays in the middle of the 19th century in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, which in those days was remote and isolated and poor and had scarcely changed in several hundred years. And he went twice, and he went walking from village to village, and he noticed something very odd. And prepare yourself for a crushingly bad joke. He was interested in surnames. And there is a whole science of surname genetics. Surnames are inherited like Y chromosomes, generally speaking. So you can do a lot with a telephone directory, and it doesn't cost very much. It was founded by Galton. Galton turned up in his first village, and he found to his surprise that everybody, in effect, in the village had the surname Spaghetti. Okay, weak joke, I told you, all right? So he noted that with curiosity, went over the hill to the next village. Everybody had the same surname, but it was Pasta. Next village over the hill, they're all called Cannelloni. And Galton thought, now this is interesting, there must be some big advantage to being called Spaghetti in village 1 and so on. But being a smart cookie, it didn't take him a minute to work out what was going on. If these villages are small, let's say with 10 families in them, 10 surnames when they were founded, any time a man has no sons, his name will disappear. He might have no children, he might have only daughters, his name will disappear, the other 9 will become more common. And in time, purely at random, one name will take over. And that's random genetic change, that's genetic drift in small populations. And the effect is powerful. We're used to thinking of ourselves as an enormously abundant species, but we're not. If you look at in terms of what the numbers of humans ought to be, given our body size in relation to other primates, the real number, the natural number of the human population is about 1/10,000th of what the population is nowadays. The natural pre-civilization, if you can call it that number, of humans is about the population of Glasgow. Whether the world would be better if it was filled by the population of Glasgow, I do not know. But that's clearly the case. And for most of human history, 99% of human history, we were effectively an endangered species living in small groups that never encountered each other. Everyone in this room saw more people on their way to this lecture than the average human being saw in his or her lifetime when we were hunter-gatherers. So everything has changed. Historically, we were rare. And historically, random accident, as a result, played a large part. You can see that to an extent nowadays. If you look at population movement, this is a slightly complex diagram here. Let's look at the purple bars here. What this is the amount of genetic variation in various populations. In Africa, Biaka and Mbuti, African populations, and then in European and Middle Eastern populations, the Druze, Danes, Chinese, Japanese. We're basically following the track as humans went across the world, okay? Until finally we got to the southern tip of South America. Not very long ago, about 15,000 a bit less years ago. And you can see the amount of genetic variation goes down absolutely linearly. And if you draw a map of the amount of human variation in relation to distance from Addis Ababa, it's amazing. It's statistics, it's not biology, it's physics, it's not biology, it kind of fits. And that is because it is physics, it's mathematics. We went through bottleneck after bottleneck after bottleneck in small populations and lost variation. So the effect was big. And the effect in some places still is big. Let me illustrate its power. Let me just think about this. Got that out, there we go. Okay, let me illustrate its power. Here's a picture of a young girl I took about 15 years ago in Finland. And I'm sorry to say that this young lady is certainly dead now because she had a rare genetic disease, variant late infantile neurolipofasciidosis. It's not going to be in the exam, which you need 2 copies of the gene to show the effect. It's like cystic fibrosis and all these things. This is Finland. Finland is an amazing place genetically. It has 33 genetic diseases known nowhere else in the world, and a huge human genetics community which has done a vast amount of research on them, partly because Finland also has extraordinarily good pedigree records. And for much of history, Finland consisted of a few islands of people surrounded by a sea of trees. And if you live on islands, you have no choice but to marry from within the small group which is available to you, which generally speaking means that you marry your relatives. And this disease is common in only one, it's not common, but it's found in only one part of Finland, and everybody who's got the disease can be put onto that pedigree. The young girl is the round black blob at the bottom there. Black means affected. Empty means probably not affected, and we can trace her mother and her father, who are shown as a heavy circle and a heavy square. We can trace them back actually to a shared ancestor who lived in the 17th century. And in fact, every case in the whole of Finland, apart from one, which I also show in A, can be traced back to that guy. So what happened was, he was perfectly healthy, he had 1 copy of the gene, but because the population was small, people married their relatives, they became inbred, as we said, and finally the gene began to show its effects. And the effect is amazingly powerful. There's a very recent piece of work, which let me talk you through. It's quite complicated, but it's interesting because it's Scottish. All right, we talked about surnames. What are surnames? Surnames are lengths of letters which are held together and passed down the generation. Jones, my wife's her surname is Percy. If we had any kids, they'd be called Jones. Or no, my wife would probably be called Percy, but be as it may. We don't scramble the surnames together, okay? Now, in general, genetics does scramble stuff together, but on a very short lengths of DNA. It doesn't. We don't get this recombination, as it's called, within the DNA over very short lengths. So that if you look at populations which have got lots and lots of long lengths of identical DNA in them, they probably are very, very inbred because they're small populations and there hasn't been the random exchange of genes among unrelated people. And what we've got here is a kind of complicated thing. And I'll just look at the right-hand thing that says greater than 10, all right? What that is, the proportion of the population in these different places that have lengths of DNA, genetic surnames, more than 10,000 DNA letters long. If you look at the yellow, let's just take the Scottish ones. Okay, let's take the, or let's talk, actually there are no 10s in mainland Scotland. Let's take the Scottish, 5 to 9.9. The Scottish ones are shown dark brown, and there's quite a few, where the hell are we? Yes. There's quite a few, about half the population has a lengths of DNA which are that long. But then let's go to Orkney, endogamous, that's the purple one, and you'll see there are fewer of them. And that's true at all lengths, okay? And that's true in Orkney in general. If you look at Orcadian DNA, there is much, much more evidence of inbreeding and small population size up on the Orkneys compared to Scotland as a whole. Scotland as a whole is quite outbred, but the Orkneys are inbred because they've been isolated in small populations, and they do indeed have certain genetic diseases which are more common there than elsewhere. So that evolution can take place quite rapidly in small populations. So what's going to happen to population size? It has increased. Evolution, as biologists often say, evolution is made in bed. Evolution turns on mating patterns. And mating patterns have changed. And they've changed in a very, very obvious way. For example, if you go to London, which is now arguably the most racially mixed population in the world, then you're in a situation where actually skin color, Afro-Caribbean versus white, makes very little difference to who you mate with and marry. In New York, for example, or in the United States rather than New York, the chances of a black woman marrying a white man are 300 times less than a black woman marrying a black man. In Britain, in London, the figure is 3 times less. So that the skin color variation is having very little effect. Actually, the best predictor who you will mate or marry is education level. Thanks. I guess most people who have been to university know that to be true, okay? So that these choice mechanisms are breaking up, but you can measure them without reference to skin color. Ask yourself the following question. How far apart were you born and your wife or partner born, compared to the distance apart that your mother and father were born, your mother's mother and your mother's father were born, and so on back into history. And I can almost guarantee, it's not always true, I can almost guarantee that in every case, that figure, that marital distance has got much greater. My case is rather extreme. My wife and I were born 3,000 miles apart because she was born in Manhattan in New York. My parents were born 3 miles apart in West Wales, and as a student once pointed out, it shows. But the effect is big. Arguably the most important event in the history of human evolution was the invention of the bicycle, okay? No longer did you have to marry the boy or the girl next door. You can get on your bicycle or your train or your 747 to a much larger pool of people and spread your genes much, much more widely. So that too has actually made the case that indeed things are changing. You can see it with my own family name. Here, this is going back to Galton and his surnames. Now we have maps of British surnames. This is a map of Jones in 1881, and you don't appear on the map until the frequency of the surname gets above 2%. So there are no Joneses in England, or hardly any. In West Wales, where I come from, my village was, even when I was born in the 1940s, was more than half Joneses. Okay, there has been enormous progress. We've been allowed out beyond the electric fence, and there are now Joneses all over the Midlands. We've got to London, and as I remember well, I even met a couple of Joneses in Edinburgh. So to summarize then, all 3 parts of the Darwinian machine, mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift, have lost their power. So if you're worried about what utopia is going to be like, you shouldn't be worrying about it because you're living in it now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve, for a really exciting and interesting talk. we're going to now take some questions for maybe 20 minutes or something like that, if you want 20 minutes worth of questions. Now, when you want to ask a question, please wait for somebody to come running to you with a microphone, because otherwise in this hall it's really difficult to hear. So who would like to ask the first question?
Is it going to be in the exam? This is always the first question. Okay. It's not like I idea to take them in twos. If you take them in twos, and you go from one to the other.
You have basically demonstrated that evolution-wise we are at the beginning of...
Sorry, I can't hear. Can you speak? I mean, I can hear the noise, but it's distorted.
Okay. So you have demonstrated that we are now evolution-wise at the beginning of a new era, but would you expect that new patterns would emerge, like selection for inability to use or immunity to contraception?
Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, that's a very Galtonian argument, actually. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the technology of it, but one of the things which evolutionists are a quarrelsome lot, okay? They spend their time arguing, splitting hairs about minutiae to do with snails and fruit flies, and indeed humans. And one of the, I don't want to go into the depths of it, but one of the arguments which there's been for years and years, in fact it was started out by a guy called Wyn Edwards in Aberdeen in the 1950s, is the argument of group selection. That actually, it doesn't matter what individuals do to evolution, what happens is which groups succeed, okay? And to the genetic future of a particular species. And that was greatly poo-pooed. But actually, it's absolutely right. And you can see that in humans, and you can see it happening in the evolutionary sense to humans today, against, in fact, my own case. If we were to look at the proportion, let's go back to the skin color genes. If we were to go back to 1492, and ask what are the proportions of white and black genes, roughly speaking, in the world, I don't know what the answer would be. My guess would be that the world frequency of light-colored European genes would be something of the order of 10% of the total, okay? If we were to go back to 1892, when Europeans had filled the Americas, Australia, present in large numbers in Africa, the incidence of what light-colored genes across the world would have gone certainly up, perhaps to 20 or 30%, maybe more. And that's, in the global sense, that's evolution, that's group selection. Nothing to do with the fact that it's good, it's sunlight or something like that. It's simply that one group is expanding itself more rapidly than another. And that's happening today in quite a subtle way. I happened to read in a paper the other day. It's clearly the case that the world population, the sexual behavior of the world population is undergoing a huge revolution. It's called I'm sure many of you know it, it's called the demographic transition. You go from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and low death rates. And the West went through that in the late 19th and early 20th century. China went through it with an astonishing speed in the last 20 years, partly because of government coercion, the one-child policy. India is going through it at great speed, far, far quicker than anybody imagined. Africa has not gone into it, but in some senses that doesn't matter, to be rather cruel, because what that means is a high birth rate, but a high death rate because of HIV and the like. But the one place that's been aberrant and has gone into it but hasn't come out is the Middle East. And the Middle East has got very high birth rates. The highest completed family size in the world are Palestinian Arabs, okay? Mean family size for women, I think, is 11. That's the mean. That's huge, okay? But they haven't come out of. They've gone into high survival rates. They've gone into high. What am I talking? Getting tangled here. They've got high birth rates, but they don't have. They haven't got. They got survival right first. Medical care in the Middle East is good, but they continued their high birth rates. So if you look at the global picture, the one group in the world which is massively expanding is the Middle East. And if you go over to the Middle East, as I sometimes do, it's obvious, immediately obvious. You go to a place like Syria or Iran, I can't remember the exact figures, but more than half the population is under 25. Now that has all kinds of interesting political implications, but it's an evolutionary phenomenon that this group's genes, which are distinct to a degree, are going to get much, much more common. And so in that sense, I suppose my case is false, but don't tell anybody that I said so.
Hello?
That's it.
Wonderful, thank you. So, at one point you say that there are less old fathers, so there's less mutation. But then at another point you emphasize the fact the human population is massive and much bigger than it should be.
Sorry, I didn't pick up the last sentence.
First you emphasize that there are less old fathers, so less mutations, but then you talk about the large human population size. So surely a huge human population size would have innumerable mutations in it, and that would overtake that would be a much more important factor in giving mutations than young and old
that's
fathers.
a good point, which again, that's much talked about in evolutionary biology. In evolutionary biology, what is the relationship between population size and evolutionary progress? I might go on for hours about it, but I won't. It's an interesting question. I don't think we know the answer in humans, but it's clearly the case that if you've got enormously abundant animal populations, then you're much more likely to get a rapid response to a sudden dose of natural selection. The classic example of that, and actually that effect was worked out here in Edinburgh, the Hill-Robertson effect. The classic example of that is houseflies. Okay, houseflies. I haven't counted the world's houseflies recently, but there are lots and lots of them. There are millions or billions of them. They were in the 1950s. They were sprayed with DDT, and that worked fine for a couple of years. And then inevitably there was a mutation which spread. So DDT no longer works. If you look at the mutation in the world's houseflies in Australia, South Africa, South America, it turns out that every single one of them has got the same DDT mutation, same change in the same gene, and also a great length of DNA unchanged on either side of that gene. So what that tells you is that mutation only happened once. And because there are so many fruit flies, it was bound to happen. The other classic example of that is HIV. HIV is actually not very infective. It's hard to get AIDS. You don't want to get it, but once you've got it, you've got it. Once you've got HIV, you're done for because all possible mutations in the HIV genome will happen inside yourself, simply because there are so many particles. They're going to happen. So there will be resistance to all possible drugs in the HIV genome, which is exactly what's happening. So population size is really, really important. Quite where we stand in its effect in humans, I don't know. I'm not sure that anybody else does too, because it turns on a historical thing called the effective population size. And the effective population size is still small because they were rare for so long. But it's an interesting question. I might dig around and see if anybody's looked further into it. A couple over there. Man in the Liberal Democrat shirt.
Thank you for a remarkable talk. I have two questions. The first is, which page of the textbook shall I read for the exam?
Well, it depends which textbook. I don't really know the answer to that. We always tell kids the exam questions anyway nowadays, so they can read the pages they need. I said, no, I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. What's the second
one? By natural selection, we have actually got rid of genetic material, but whereas now this process is not happening, so we're keeping more genetic material alive. Could that be exploited to advantage in the future?
Well, most people, I mean, the question is, has natural selection, the relaxation of natural selection, has it allowed genes to survive, which otherwise would have died out? I think that's clearly true. It's got nothing to do with medical advance, or very little to do with medical advance. It's got everything to do with sewage works, clean water, that kind of stuff. The reason all those kids died long ago in London was things like cholera. And there are certainly genes that give resistance to cholera, and many of those who died did not carry those genes. Now there's no cholera, so those bad genes, in inverted commas, that make you susceptible to cholera are now being passed on. Okay? So that's certainly true. And that was one of Galton's arguments, that by being kind to people, allowing them to survive, you were polluting the genetic future. I always use what I think of as the spectacles argument. I wear glasses, okay? And if life becomes even more of a blur if I take them off. In the days before glasses, if I was a hunter-gatherer, I would starve to death or be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, because I'd see this large animal coming towards me and I'd stroke it and say, nice tiger, and then it would bite my head off, all right? So there was strong natural selection against people with defective eyesight, and there certainly is genetic basis to defective eyesight. And that stopped when spectacles were invented. But as long as we've got spectacles, it doesn't matter. So I think the case is that as long as we've got medical care, clean water and that kind of thing, it doesn't matter. And Galton's argument was, we should go back to living, short lives that are short, British and nasty. Life was hell in Britain in hunter-gatherer days, probably, and in early farmer days. Life is much, much better now. What would you prefer, to live in comfort in Morningside or to be struggling to pull a crop off the starving fields of East Lothian? I think I know the answer to that. About using this data in these genes in the future, I don't really know. There is one observation which is really very odd, which has to do with HIV/AIDS, which is a whole big story in its own right. There are a number of genes that protect against HIV, some of which are in Africa, and it's arguable that they've evolved to protect against HIV because HIV has been in Africa for a long time. But something like 1 person in 6 in this room has got a copy of a variant in a gene called CCR5, a deletion, a little bit missing, which is if you've got 1 or even better 2 copies of that, and you're unfortunate enough to become infected with HIV, then you are much more likely to survive than somebody who has no copies of it. Now that's really, really weird, because we know that HIV, the virus, did not get to the outside Africa until 1971. And there's no way in hell that it's going to spread, this gene is going to have spread at that time. But if you look at the map of where this gene is common, it's common in North Germany, it's common in Denmark, it's commoner in Scotland than it is in England. It is said that it overlaps the area of, I think, high cholera attacks. No, the Black Death, histories of high levels of Black Death. So it may have been a gene that evolved to protect against the Black Death, which is an incidental, is now able to protect against a totally different disease, which is HIV. So maybe in some ways, by retaining all this variation in a large population, allowing people to survive, maybe we are having an insurance policy for the future, but you should come back and ask me in 500 years.
And there's another gentleman in the back there.
Given that human populations are now exercising much more freedom of choice over fertility, is there likely to be a sense in which natural selection will favor the desire to have children rather than just the desire to have sex?
That may well be true. And I kind of made that point in a rather confused way when I talked about the Middle East, where there's a desire to have children. It's interesting, if you go around the world and you interview people, how many children do you want? How many children would you like to have when you get old? That's the question. Almost everywhere, apart from the Middle East, the answer is 2. Okay, and it's quite striking, actually. It's a very narrow distribution. I've got a slide of it. There it is. Yay! Look at that. Thank you for that question. All right. That's the figure for Europe. But the same is true in India, the same is true in China, except for the Middle East. So I think in the end, there will be some people who choose to have no children, but there seems to be a strong desire to have 2 children, which is, of course, the number of children that people have had almost exactly since humans evolved. They had many more, but most of them died. But for 99% of human history, people had 2 surviving children, and people still, roughly speaking, have 2 and a bit surviving children. I don't think that desire not to reproduce, although it's certainly appearing, there's no question of that. I don't think the effect will have much of an effect yet, but it may do in the future.
Okay, there's one more over here.
I was, I guess, confused by your talk. You began by saying the answer is yes, so you can leave, and finished by saying the answer is no, but don't tell anybody. I mean, when asked, will there be selection for new behaviors like contraception or wanting to have children, you said yes. Is there an enormous well of mutations in our 8 billion population, vastly bigger than ever before? The answer is yes. And are there large-scale gene frequency changes for genes for diabetes and all the thousands, tens of thousands of other lethal and semi-lethal mutations that are now increasing in frequency as they've never seen? They're the ones that are in utopia. So I just can't see how the answer can remotely be yes, it stopped.
I'm not sure I agree with you. I mean, first of all, when you talk about things like diabetes, okay, the reason for the great increase in diabetes is not a great increase in diabetes genes, if such a thing exists, which probably do actually, but a great increase in obesity and in overeating. So the genes are just manifesting their effects in a way which they had not done before. So the genes themselves have not changed frequency. I did put the sort of health warning on at the beginning, which I accept, which is if you're asking, are gene frequencies changing? Let's just talk about Britain. In the British population, the answer is obviously yes. Perhaps less obvious in this audience than in a London audience, which will have kids of Asian, of African, of South American ancestry in them, and there will be more or less random mating among that group. Now, that's a gene frequency change, and I'm very happy to put my hands up and say that's happening. But if you talk about evolution in the sense that most people believe it, in the utopian or the dystopian sense, that the human race is going to alter its behavior, its appearance, everything that makes us human, in the way that it has done very rapidly over the last few 100,000 years, I'm still pretty confident the answer is no.
Okay, well, I think that's probably a good question to end on. And I'm going to hand over now to Ian to say thank you.
So I've just got a very few thank yous to say. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Steve for taking time out of a very hectic schedule to give us this talk this evening, which was very enjoyable. As Mary mentioned, this lecture is not just an Enlightenment lecture, it's actually also a research staff development event. And the university and the research funding bodies have put a lot of effort into trying to develop research staff, and particularly skills to do with communication and media. And so events like this give us the opportunity to hear world-class communicators talk to us. And that's a very important aspect of being a scientist in the current era. It's worth pointing out the University of Edinburgh is very good at this, and the university has been nominated this year for the 4th year running for a Times Higher Education Award in this area. I would like to thank some of the people involved in organising this, so Vice Principal Mary Bounds, Deep Theda Silva Williams, Jane Halley and Colin Sharp for their help in supporting and organising the event, and also to Sheila Thompson and Natalie Poyser, who are responsible for the Research Developer Programme at the university. So it remains for me to ask you all to show your appreciation once again to Steve for his lecture this evening. Thank you.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.